Hello, I am Mantastic and Fantastic, and today I'm going to be helping you navigate through the dungeon challenge from an offensive point of view in Creature Quest. So, in Creature Quest, there are three distinct gameplay modes. There is questing, there is the PvE Battle Tower, and the dungeon challenge, which is the PvP or player versus player weekly tournaments. And while the weekly tournaments do have two distinct components, this video and article will be focusing on the offensive guide or offensive point of view. Furthermore, I do have a new player's guide as well as a dungeon defense guide written already, as well as corresponding videos, so you can take a look there if you want to have more information from them. So, what is the dungeon challenge? Well, basically the dungeon challenge is the weekly player versus player ladder that basically allows you to climb up and down based on your wins and losses, and it allows you to attack other players with your team of 5 while creating a dungeon of varying floors to defend your prestige. And prestige is the numerical value that is assigned to basically your ranking, and basically the more points you acquire, the higher your overall ranking will be. Furthermore, you basically use challenge points, which are a type of currency to attack other players. They recharge every hour, and they also can award energy as a reward for actually clearing each other player's dungeons. However, the real reason you play the challenge dungeons is for the end of week rewards, which can include gold, like in-game gold, include diamonds, tokens, tickets, as well as legendary creatures. Furthermore, to help kind of even the playing field, we have been divided up into gold, silver, and bronze tiers. So it's very worthwhile your effort to actually put your time and energy into playing the dungeon challenge, because the collateral benefits are very rewarding, as well as kind of being the more exciting aspect of the game, because it has an element of competition as well as being new or fresh every single week. It's not the same thing over and over again. And ideally, you want to try and move up into gold and then try and place well enough to acquire legendary creatures every week. And that's great because it's a great source to acquire rare and powerful creatures to help bolster your own team and defense moving forward. And finally, I strongly encourage you to join a guild, because a guild will not only add a social aspect, but provide additional rewards at the end of the week based on how well the guild does overall. So, what is the goal for a dungeon offense? Well, naturally, the goal for a dungeon offense is to successfully attack your opponent and defeat their dungeon. However, unlike the defense win rates, your offense rates will tend to be significantly higher, just because you are able to preview your opponent's dungeon as well as creating a customized team to help somewhat counteract their abilities and mechanics. So in theory, your win rates should be significantly higher than your defense rates. And that's something to keep in mind, because you should not be off-put by the fact that your dungeon defense rate, say, is like 10-15%, but your offense rate is like 85-90%. So how does prestige and thus the numerical ranking system work? So prestige is basically your points that are assigned, and you gain prestige for each offensive victory, each defensive victory, but you will lose prestige for every defense you fail, but there is no penalty whatsoever for failing an offense. But the way the prestige amount is calculated is your opponent's prestige divided by your prestige times 100. So that means if you, say, attack an opponent with 2,500 prestige and you have 2,000, you will actually gain 125 prestige from a victory. So it is important to obviously try and attack players who are higher than you, because they will award you more points. And in an ideal world, you want to try and gain more than 100 points per attack or offense, because it's just more value overall. Furthermore, and while I'm explaining the revenge system, it's important to attack people above you, because you will lose less points when they attack you back. So the revenge system is a way to kind of allow you to get back at players who attacked you, or conversely, you have attacked and they will have a chance to revenge themselves against you. So whenever you attack an opponent, whether you win or lose, you will be placed on their revenge list. So normally when you try and select an opponent, you have a choice of 3 different options, which you can reroll every 5 minutes, but you also have a revenge tab, and the revenge tab will show basically all the players that have attacked your dungeon, and you have 24 hours to use these revenges against them, and it will allow you to basically earn back some of the prestige that may have been lost through a defeat. And this is very important to understand, because normally when you attack an opponent's dungeon, you actually will be put on their revenge list and have the chance of being attacked back. However, when you revenge someone else, you do not get placed back on the revenge list. It doesn't work that way. So basically, you want to try and clean up your revenge list every day because it minimizes the chances of you appearing on someone's attack list. So that is important, as well as being aware that if you attack someone higher than you, they're most likely going to attack you back. But if they still were higher than you to begin with, you will have had a net gain in prestige. Conversely, if you attack someone lower than you and you defeat them, but if you know they can beat your dungeon, that's actually going to be a net loss for you because they will revenge you back and they will gain more points than you did, and you will subsequently go down overall. So basically, to summarize it, you want to try and pick off everyone on your revenge list because it does not run the risk of you being attacked back. So another thing to point out is at the end of the week / tournament frenzy, basically at the very end of each of the weekly dungeon challenge events, there's going to be somewhat of a frenzy to secure your ranking and subsequent rewards. So generally for the last couple of hours, you will tend to see a lot of movement and shifts in rankings and player distribution because that's where people tend to play the most, refill their challenge points, and basically just try and keep going at that point in time. So just be aware of that, and if possible, try and play during those last hour or so. And also, you want to try and clean out your revenge list because you will not appear on those people's attack lists again. So, choosing an opponent. Well, the first goal for choosing an opponent is to make sure you actually can beat them. Like, losing an offense obviously does not yield you any benefits, so you want to try and make sure you actually can beat them. And you always want to try and make it so you can hopefully beat someone, and ideally they cannot attack you back so you don't get revenged afterwards. But for the most part, you want to try and attack someone who's higher than you because even if you get revenge back, you have a net gain overall. But once you find an appropriate target, you should always inspect their dungeon to help better plan your offense. Because when you inspect their dungeon, you can basically find any weak points or help guide you in terms of what colors you should bring for your team. So, there is a color counter flowchart in Creature Quest, and this is an amazing aspect of the game because it allows you to basically have an elaborate rock, paper, scissors style gameplay in which water is particularly effective against fire, but weak against electric. So that means any of these 4 colors, they're strong against one, but they're weak against another. Basically, they'll deal 2 times damage or deal 2 times less damage against subsequent cards. Furthermore, your water creature will take double damage from electric cards, so it's very important that you don't bring vulnerable cards to their floor 1 because you want to understand how this works because it can be crucial to your success because on floor 1 that is when you're most vulnerable, and if you bring a water heavy team into an electric heavy dungeon, you're going to have a bad time. So for example, from this screenshot here, this player has created a full monofire floor 1 with very heavy single target nukes. And that means if you bring any wood creatures, you're going to have a bad time because they're most likely going to die before you have any chance to mass any sort of counterattack or special abilities. Furthermore, on wave 2, you have an electric heavy floor, which will counter any wood creatures that were brought. So basically, it's kind of a way to help protect itself. Sorry, counter any water creatures that are brought. Because if you bring water to counter floor 1, you're going to have a significantly harder floor 2 because everything there is going to resist your damage significantly, and it's going to be tough for you to actually penetrate through. So this is why doing your research is important, because if you entered blindly with some wood creature, they're probably going to get burnt to a crisp, and you're going to have a bad day moving forward. So you want to try and spot weak points in their defense, and generally speaking, weak points tend to apply to underleveled, non-evolved, inappropriately sized, or non-awoken creatures. And this will vary across bronze, silver, and gold, and what you want to try and do is find any weak point that you can exploit or have a team that helps better counter it. Because, for instance, let's say this floor 1 was, none of them had awakenings. It wouldn't be as lethal, so that's kind of like a weak point, for instance. But generally speaking, floor 1 will be the toughest time because you do start at 0 mana. And when you do find weak points, like say creatures that are the wrong size or just underleveled evolved, you can either ignore them because they're not a threat, or you can pick them off quickly to gain additional mana early on. So, from my own experience playing gold for several weeks now, I find that the most common monocolored floors tend to be electric or yellow, or fire, which is red. And this is because those 2 elements tend to counter the more meta team colors available, because for the most part, most players tend to run at least something water, most notably Siren, as a way to heal themselves and sustain, so the electric helps counter that heavily. In addition, the red counters green cards, and right now Green Giant is somewhat overpowered, so those heavy red floors help counter it, as well as being possibly one of the more popular healers that's legendary is a Druid, who is also green. So for the most part, those two tend to be the most common monocolored floors you encounter. So if you have, like, say, you have a electric or fire heavy team, they're at least not weak against those two. So in addition to that, you also want to inspect their bosses, because for the most part, you can nuke down bosses with relative ease. However, you still should make sure you actually have the capacity to burst them down. Because let's say they have a green boss and you have a yellow or electric heavy team. You're not going to be nuking them very hard, and that can become a problem. So you want to make sure your nukes or your heavy hitters are not resisted against their bosses. Furthermore, you want to try and avoid bosses with either counterattack abilities or phoenixes if you're unprepared. Because counterattack abilities, for the most part, do something detrimental to your team when that creature is hit by a special ability. So that could mean you get stunned back, you take additional damage, or they heal themselves. It's just not a good scenario. In addition, the Phoenix tends to be a tough spawn if you can't nuke it down fast enough or you don't have a cleanse. And that's why research is important, because if you enter blindly, the Phoenix will probably burn your whole team down without actually dying. So again, from my own experience, I find that the strongest dungeon defenders, in no particular order, tend to be the Green Giant, the Sandworm, the Phoenix, and possibly the VIP 8 Angel, just because they tend to have the most threat and they're hard to kill for the most part. So when you're building your team to lead an offense against your rivals' dungeons, you want to try and keep the following points in mind. Most notably, you want to try and bring a mixture of special abilities, which I will go into detail about. But loosely speaking, special abilities can be grouped into several categories, and they can either be single target or area of effect in nature. So they are stuns, silences, a primary healer, off healers, debuffs, buffs, and burst damage. Now, while some creatures only fulfill those one roles, they may have overlap in several different categories, and it's just a matter of understanding how that special ability works. So, stuns are probably the most common form of crowd control, basically because it disables an opposing creature by increasing the number of turns until they can attack. So for example, if that creature would be attacking in 2 turns and you apply a 4-turn stun, they have 4 turns added onto their timer. Now, this will not actually impact subsequent turns. They'll still be, like, say, a 2-turn timer moving forward, and only delays them for when the stun lands. So this is very crucial for dealing with powerful bosses, because it allows you to have enough time to set up your own combos to burst them down safely. Now, one thing you should note is that you cannot reapply a stun to a creature until they're able to actually take their turn as usual. That means you can't basically chain stuns and permanently lock something out from actually taking their turn. However, you are able to layer a stun with a silence to add another layer of crowd control to help ensure you have a safe window of opportunity to burst them down. So when you are playing through the dungeon challenges, you must bring at least 1, but ideally 2 stuns/silences in case one of them fails. The next type of crowd control is silence, and silences tend to be a little bit more rare than stuns, just from my own experience and other players. There just seems to be more stuns available. But silences work a little differently than stuns. They don't delay their turn timers, but instead the silence actually prevents them from using a special ability for X number of turns, basically how long that silence lasts for. So that means when a creature is silenced, they will still take their turn as normal, but they won't be casting their special ability. They will instead hit with their basic attack. So largely, for the most part, a basic attack does almost no damage compared to how much a special ability does. So basically it's kind of a way of delaying their special ability from occurring, but you still will take some damage from a basic attack. So again, it's a way to help set up your combo synergy for your own burst damage, and you can layer a stun with a silence. You can stun someone and silence them. So that means on the very first turn that they are able to actually do their actual ability, they will be silenced and just hit with a basic attack. And because now the stun is wore off, you can reapply a stun again and basically keep that creature locked out from doing harm to your team. So this is actually very powerful mechanic, and ideally if you have, like, say, a stun and silence, it's a great way to prevent a boss from ever hitting or touching your team in a threatening manner. The next type of special abilities are primary healers, And primary healer's sole role is basically to restore health to your team in order to help you sustain through longer fights or just survive in general. And they tend to have very limited offensive capabilities, and they're basically a purely support role. But they tend to have the greatest potential to keep your team topped off compared to off healers because that's all they are quote-unquote good for. Furthermore, many healers feature a cleanse ability, and cleanses remove X number of debuffs from your team or creatures, and that can allow you to either remove stuns, silences, poisons, or any other dangerous abilities that have been placed on your team. So again, they fill these two useful roles of being a cleanser as well as a strong healer. Unfortunately, primary healers tend to be a lot squishier in nature. They tend to have lower health and lower defense ratings, and they have a very high chance of being bursted down on floor 1. So you have to be very careful. You don't want to bring a green healer into a fire-heavy floor because they will be burnt very fast. So you want to make sure that healer stays alive, but once your healer can stay alive and get their first heal off, you tend to be able to survive for most of the dungeon because your team will be topped off for the most part. And this kind of leads me into the next form of healers, which are off healers. And off healers are basically cards who can function basically as a lesser healer. They do have a healing component, but they tend to have some other aspect built into them, usually some sort of damage or buff. And while their special ability does restore health, it restores significantly less. So it becomes somewhat crucial you do combo them with either, say, 8 times or at least 4 times so that they do heal a respectable amount of health, because otherwise you're not going to be healing enough to sustain yourself like a primary healer would. But there are great benefits to off healers because A, they do damage, so they do help contribute towards bursting down various floors and characters, and they tend to be significantly more durable. They tend to have much higher values of health and defense, so it's less likely they get bursted down, so they're more able to keep your team topped off. So by running off healers, this is actually very beneficial, and it can be safer than a primary healer in certain scenarios. The next type of special abilities are debuffs. And debuffs are basically special abilities that apply a negative status effect to your opponents. It could either lower their power, attack, defense, luck, or apply a damage over time. And generally speaking, debuffing their luck is very important because it'll allow you to land your special abilities and most likely stuns and silences more easily. In addition, debuffing their defense tends to make it so you do more damage, so it can have merits, but debuffing is not as crucial to the success of your teams, but they usually come with some other collateral benefits. So if you can facilitate a debuff into your team, it is a useful thing to have. The next are buffs, and buffs are basically the reverse. Instead of hindering your opponent, they make you stronger, and they can also provide mend. But these stats can be quite amazing, especially in longer fights, which generally don't apply too much in dungeon challenges, but buffing your luck can help ensure that you land your stun silences, and mends are a very budget heal for shorter fights. Basically, mends allow you to restore some health whenever that creature does a special ability or a basic attack. So it's kind of a way to have a very budget heal. Again, if a mend is built into a certain character, why not run it and utilize that extra amount of healing? And then last but not least is burst damage. So basically, while most special abilities have secondary features or other benefits they provide, some are just purely oriented for dealing large amounts of damage. And you need to run at least one burst damage style character on your team in order to successfully kill an opponent's monster or opponent's creature, because even though they lack those collateral benefits, the idea is you combo them up and then burst heavily to nuke down their creatures. And this is crucial because you want to try and make sure they're at least an 8 times or a 16 times multiplier to ensure that you actually kill floors relatively quick and you don't dance around and run the risk of having your creatures picked off. So one last point to consider with burst damage is, generally speaking, white or black creatures tend to be the best for this because A, they are unresisted. And that unresistedness is very important because it allows you to deal full damage or bonus damage against their effective color without, and basically allows you to ensure that you actually burst down the opponent's creature. Because let's say you bring a water nuke and you are faced with an electric boss, they're not going to be hitting very hard, and your strategy, if it's revolving around them as your burst, may somewhat falter because you're not able to successfully kill them fast enough. So, in summation, for team building, you want to bring 1 to 2 silence/stuns, one form of healing at least, as well as one hard burst nuke as a general rule of thumb. Naturally, your team composition may vary, but for the most part, you tend to want to have those types of special abilities on your team to at least counter the most wide array of encounters you may find. And finally, I still want to stress that floor 1 is where most battles are won or lost, because floor 1 is where you are most vulnerable, and this is because you have 0 mana and your opponent's creatures may be charged up right away and start casting their special abilities. So if you can survive the floor 1, you tend to have a very strong chance of actually defeating your opponent's dungeon. So, in conclusion, the Dungeon Challenge is one of the more exciting aspects of Creature Quest because it provides countless replay value, because it's never the same thing over and over again, because it's different every single time in every single league. Furthermore, the rewards are very lucrative and worth pursuing. So, by being able to intelligently choose an opponent through careful scouting, building a competent team, and understanding how the revenge system works will be keys to success for climbing prestige every single week. I wish you the best of luck in all your Creature Quest adventures, and happy puzzling. I mean, happy questing. That's my other tagline from my other game.